Hello YouTube, this is Guy That Knows It All, 88. Today we're going to talk about the Sega Gamegear. People with Sega Gamegear often have capacitor failure, in which results in the screen not working properly. Many people blame this on the bad batch of capacitors that were released in the early 90s, but there is really no record of this. And just to be honest, if it was a bad batch, it would have resulted in just one of the capacitors in the Game Gear just being bad, and not necessarily all of them. It's just not plausible, because there's different capacitors in there. So there's actually more than one batch of capacitors there, since there's different capacitors in there. If you get where I'm coming from on this. Some people might actually have the re-release model that came out in 2000, 10 years later from the original release, and of course don't have any problem. But of course, with what I've discovered through looking into it, the newer models are just as vulnerable to having a problem. They just haven't. It hasn't happened because it hasn't been used as much. So anyway, just to go ahead and just dive right on into it. What ultimately happens is anyone who has a Game Gear knows that the battery life is fairly short in comparison to the Game Boy and many other handhelds, and this basically leads us to using the power adapter from the Sega Genesis Model 2 to power the Game Gear. Why not? Because when it plugs in, and the console works with it. The problem happens is that the actual power supply for the Genesis actually produces more like 13, 14 volts of power. Granted, the actual power supply itself does say 9 or 10 volts, depending on which one you have, rating on it, but it actually does produce more than that if you were to actually measure the tip that plugs into the console. And the Game Gear itself requires 9 volts actually entering the console. After all, when you look at the batteries, once you add all the voltage of the batteries in there, it comes up to being 9 volts. So instead, you're putting 9 volts. You're putting in 13, 14, and I've even seen some actually as high as 15. I have several consoles, several Sega Genesis consoles, and yeah, it's pretty much consistently. And it's this excess voltage that results in the capacitors failing on the consoles. And the reason why the power supply actually produced more voltage is because that the main consoles, the Genesis console, the 32X, the Sega CD, the Sega Nomad even, which is a very good comparison to the Game Gear, all those other consoles have what's known as a power regulator. You can identify a power regulator by finding a transistor, which is often connected to a heatsink. And basically, the power regulator system, what it does is your power supply actually outputs a higher voltage than what the console itself actually needs. And it does this because the power that comes out of your wall, it's full of noise, surges, and other irregularities. And electronics don't particularly like these irregularities. It likes a steady DC voltage. And that can't really be attained without the power regulator system. So to do that, what happens is the console is provided with a higher voltage, and the regulator system actually drops the voltage down to a set point based on how the regulator system is set up, and drops it down to its proper voltage, and that excess voltage becomes heat, which that's why they're most time attached to heat sinks to absorb that heat. After opening a Game Gear myself, I realized it did not have a power regulator of any sort inside of it. And of course, this can easily be tested, and this is actually how you prevent capacitors from failing, is by actually providing a power adapter that outputs the proper voltage that the console needs to operate at. Because for a power regulator system to allow any power to reach your console, it needs a higher voltage to come into it. If you put the exact voltage the console needs, the exact amount of voltage that the regulator, or anywhere near what the regulator regulates it to, it won't let no power go through at all. And so ultimately what you do is you just get a power supply that outputs that proper voltage, and by doing that, your console will turn on and work just fine. And just to point out, obviously the minimum amount of voltage that you can get a console to operate at and function just fine is ideal. And the best solution, that a very easy, just you can buy it right off the shelf, or you may actually already have it, is a mini PlayStation power adapter. This will plug right into your Game Gear, and it provides 7.5 volts, which is on the lower end. Like if you were basically using rechargeable batteries on your Game Gear, they provide about 7.5 volts. So basically, you're just providing the minimum amount of power that the console really needs to operate, and that results in a lot less stress on those capacitors. And the console should be able to outlive you. You should not have to worry about changing. And, if you have the later model Game Gear, you shouldn't have to ever worry about changing those capacitors. And if you have already changed those capacitors, then you shouldn't have to worry about changing them ever again. Anyway, I hope this video has been helpful, and thank you for watching.